Thank you, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live. Tonight, we will get a glimpse of the current crisis in the Catholic Church today, but do so through the eyes of history, because it's not the first time. And we have the church history expert and specialist, Rod Bennett, with us to see how Catholics through the ages have responded to pervasive corruption in the clergy, and including worse than what we have now, and how persevering in the faith, especially by the lay people, can lead to a cleansing of the house of God and a renewal of faith. Before we get to Rod and his comments, I want to welcome EWTN's Vice President of Programming and Production, Mr. Peter Gagnon, to talk about a number of upcoming special events this month. Peter, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great,
good,
Father.
Good,
Thanks
good.
for having me.
What you got coming up here that I don't even know about?
It's the beginning of the year, but it's going to be very, very busy for our production department.
Yes.
We have, so March, obviously, we have our pro-life events, and
Yes.
the big one from Washington, D.C. So we start on the 17th with the Vigil Mass from the Shrine in D.C., from the Basilica, and then the next day there's the opening Mass for the pro-life Mass, followed by our complete coverage of March for Life. You can't find coverage anywhere else except on EWTN, full coverage like that. We'll have
Some
people
of the
on
networks pretend it doesn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. So we give people the truth of what's happening at events. We show them what's happening on the ground. We show them the huge crowds. We have Teresa Tomeo, Damon Owens there. Catherine Hadro will be hosting with Father Patrick from DC. And then, so full coverage all day for that. If people think they can't see it on their cable system or dish, we're streaming it as well. So many ways to see it. The next day, we go to the West Coast, One Life LA. So we'll cover the rally there for that event. And then later that evening is the pro-life Mass from LA, Los Angeles as well. And then the following week, we go back to the West Coast for the Walk for Life West Coast. Catherine Hadro will go out there for that as well, coverage, along with Father John Paul and Brother John Therese. So a lot of pro-life coverage, but also in the midst of that, we have the Holy Father going to Panama for World Youth Day.
Yeah.
So we'll have Father Mark will be on the ground there. We'll do coverage in all three languages, English, Spanish, and German, people on the ground. And that coverage begins on Tuesday, the 22nd, with the opening Mass, and then the Holy Father arrives Wednesday, and then really the youth events start on that Thursday. So people should go to our website, EWTN.com, to find the air times in all your different regions. And also, please keep all our production crews in their prayers, because they're traveling throughout the U.S. and throughout the world for this coverage.
Yeah, I'll be going over to the March for Life
That's
in
right,
Washington
you'll be there
this year.
for that. So
We have a clip about World Youth Day. Let's take a look at it.
Join the youth of the world in Panama this January.
A young, vibrant church will gather to meet the Vicar of Christ at World Youth Day 2019. And EWTN will bring you all the events of this incredible encounter.
Father Mark, Mary Christina, Jason Everett, and Doug Keck will bring you live coverage of this life-changing pilgrimage.
We'll see you in Panama.
Coverage begins Tuesday, January 22nd, here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Well, see what's coming up.
That's
Thank
right.
you, Peter, for letting us know about all this. And we'll be back in a couple minutes with our guest for tonight, so please stay with us. All right, well, welcome back. We have a guest tonight who is a church history specialist, as well as the author of several wonderful books. I really enjoy his books. And his latest offering, uses the church's past to put the present crisis that we have in the church in historical perspective. He's the author of this new book called Bad Shepherds, The Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived While Bishops Did the Devil's Work. So please welcome Mr. Rod Bennett. Good to have you.
It's
welcome.
always good to be here.
Good. Yeah. This is something that is an important topic. I've mentioned a number of times to my audience in the past how my father was staunchly against me being a priest, and one of his many attempts to dissuade me was to give me a book called The Bad Popes and daring me to read it. And so I took the dare, I read it, and he said, "Well, you didn't read that book, did you?" I said, "Yeah, I did. It was great." And he said, "What do you mean great?" I said, "Well, you notice that there were bad popes," which I had known about from grammar school even, but also none of the bad popes declared any dogmas. They didn't do any false teachings, didn't live the teachings of Christ, but they didn't do false ones. And secondly, they were always followed by reformers. Saints came up to undo the mess.
Yeah, it's
Now, what have you
fascinating.
got on this topic?
Well, it was an interesting subject. I mentioned in the introduction that I felt a little like C.S. Lewis when he wrote his book, The Screwtape Letters. That's been a wonderful book for helping people to recognize the tricks of temptation
Right.
in their own lives.
That's right.
But he said it was hard, dry, dusty work.
Yeah.
And this was kind of a terrible subject too, to write a little chronicle of the lowlights, if you see what I'm saying.
Sure.
I subtitled the book at one point, 5 Eras when the clergy did the devil's work. And that's what the book is 5 historical periods, the most recent one being the French Revolution, where we get to see the clergy at its worst. So very much the bad pope story you were talking about.
And I'd like just to, so that folks understand these 5 eras. One is the time of the Arian heresy.
That's right, yeah.
That's the first one. Second one is 10th, 11th century,
That's right.
where tremendous corruption of the papacy.
Yeah, I
and
call that
clergy.
the post-apocalyptic church, when things had fallen pretty far in the Western Empire and things were sort of quasi-civilized.
Right.
And so the clergy responded in kind, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, it was the second period of barbarian invasions between the Saracen Muslims and the Magyars and the Norsemen. So this was all part of the chaos.
Right.
Third period is the time of the 14th or the 15th century with the papacy being in Avignon.
Right, the
And they were-
captivity,
yeah.
Babylonian captivity
Right.
of the papacy, it's sometimes
And
called.
then the time of the Reformation.
Right, the crises that led to the Reformation, really.
And then the time of the French Revolution and before, when French nationalism even dominated the mentality of the clergy.
That's right, yeah.
All right, those are the 5 periods. Where do you want to start with these?
Well, I think it might be best to take a few minutes because this is a little bit of an unwholesome chronicle.
It is.
I
It
mean, there
is.
is some real nasty stuff in these stories.
Well, they're
you
scoundrels.
might think, well, what's the purpose of writing a book where you bring out so many skeletons out of the closet? Mightn't that shake somebody whose faith is already a little shaky, or
Right.
cause somebody not to consider the claims of the Catholic faith? And I thought about all that very carefully as I was preparing the book. But the reason for going ahead eventually was that I found that the subject matter, paradoxically, is rather encouraging to people. Now that seems strange, but what it does is, the current crisis in the church is horrific enough, and the cover-ups associated with it so scandalous, that people can become dismayed and bordering on despair sometimes. There are people who don't go to church anymore, who have left off the faith or become bitter or whatever. And And so there's a danger in telling these kind of stories. But the paradox I found is that a lot of people are actually encouraged to hear that it's not the end of the world. Now, I want to finesse that just a little bit. It might be the end of the world. Part of the
That's God's business.
Part of the Christian faith is we believe in the imminent return of Christ. So the second coming is something we look forward to with joy. So it may be the end of the world. But if it is, it's not because things have never been this bad before. Because they have.
right.
And maybe worse.
Yeah, I would certainly say the 10th, 11th century was far worse. than
Right.
this.
And when you realize that, you realize two things: that you're part of a big family that has gone back for 2,000 years now, who ever since the days of Judas, keep in mind, think about it, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, undoubtedly chosen by Christ himself. So there's no question that he was a genuine authorized
After an
representative.
all-night vigil.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he took a vigil for the ones that the Father wanted him to choose.
Exactly right. And Judas, I mean, if you think about it, Judas is a man who sat through every sermon in the New Testament, in the Gospels. I mean, he was present at the Sermon on the Mount, all the other things. And there's no reason to think that he didn't go out amongst the other 12 when they were sent out, and the rest of the disciples sent out,
Absolutely.
the 70.
He helped distribute the loaves and fish.
That's right. And there's
was
no
there for the
reason to think
miracles.
that he didn't come back with the rest of them and say, rejoicing, saying the devils are subject to us. And, they'd gone out and done miracles. To think that a man like that could do what Judas eventually did, there's a profound mystery in that. And it's connected to this issue of malfeasance and failure and disaster amongst the clergy. So it's not unheard of. So when people realize that it's been there since literally day one, since the days of the 12 apostles, the phenomenon of the bad shepherd has always been with us.
And it's not just Judas. I mean, I point out that right after, within a couple hours of being ordained, the first 12 bishops, and having received their first Holy Communion, one of the first bishops betrays Jesus with a kiss. 11 bishops run away in the face of danger, and the Pope denies even knowing him. Not a very good start for the church.
Right. It's also, the lesson, if among many, I'm sure, is that don't be surprised when things like this happen.
Yep.
Now, if you say, well, why would the Lord plan it that way? Why would he pick somebody like Judas, whom the Bible tells us he knew in advance was a devil? He uses that word. We don't know the answer to that question. There's been a lot of guesswork through the ages, but it's very much associated with the question of why God allows human free will to continue at all.
And I think you have to look at the parables of the weeds that the devil sowed among the wheat, and the Lord said to let them grow together.
Right.
The bad fish caught with the good fish, and one parable after another. So our Lord is aware that the existence of evil, what St. Paul describes, I think, to Timothy as the mystery of evil, is something that we cope with in the church. And we can't pretend that we're going to all float on clouds and no problems here. We are the problem.
Right. I think part of what set us up for this is that the church has been, to some degree, blessed with saintly popes in recent centuries. We've had a lot of great saints in the church. And to some degree, it's natural and right that we should accentuate the positive, as Johnny Mercer used to encourage us.
Yes.
But after a while, it's also possible that people can begin to get sick from being fed on a cotton candy diet. And there's an advantage to being sobered up from that kind of diet that actually feels good after a while. That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, and that's why I encourage people to read history and know what actually happened. Now, in this first crisis of the Arian heresy, it was Blessed John Cardinal Newman who pointed out that 85% of the bishops in the Eastern Church had become Arian heretics, denying the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people encourage me. They said, well, people don't know from theology. Don't focus on theology. The reason why this story is important of the Arian crisis of the 4th century that led to the Great Nicene Council and also many important watersheds in church history. One of the reasons it's important to tell this story is that although it involves theology, to a large degree, theology was a pretext. In other words, there was a convenient piece of theology that, for reasons we won't go deeply into now, would have been helpful in bringing unconverted pagans into the new order. Christianity had risen so high in the Roman Empire that even the Roman emperor himself, Constantine, was converted and had to be bow the knee to a bishop. Very strange idea. Had to admit that he was not just in charge of religion anymore, as he was under the paganism, but he was a layperson, a spiritual son of the church.
Yeah, when you see Julius Caesar and his grandnephew Octavian, Augustus Caesar, come along, they were the priests.
That's right.
They bought the priesthoods, and no way did they ever bow to a pagan priest.
That's right. So the watershed.
Inconceivable.
Right.
And so, that scene that you describe in your book, your other book, of how the emperor Constantine kissed the wounds of the bishops,
confessors,
who had their eyes plucked out, their hands cut off, and all sorts of other mangles. So that was new.
An incredible scene.
Yeah.
But imagine if you're a pagan, you're part of the Roman Empire's 60 or more percent who hadn't become Christian yet by this point. You're thinking, how do I fit into the new order here? Am I going to become the new persecuted underclass? Just the other day, 10 years or so ago, the Christians were the persecuted minority.
Right.
Is the shoe on the other foot now, you know?
Right. Well, the Christians persecute the
That's
pagans.
right. And so in order to ease that transition, a certain set of people, both within and without the church, I call them social engineers in the book, latched upon a certain subset of belief that was held by a minority, such a small minority that it was voted down by a vote of 311 to 2 at the Nicene Council, but latched onto that little piece of minority theology called Arianism, which is essentially a defective understanding of the divinity of Christ.
Yeah,
Not a denial of it, but a very bad misunderstanding of it. They latched onto that piece of theology as a pretext for mounting an effort to streamline Christianity so that it would be better for pagans to convert to. Now, those of you in the audience who may have heard of the Da Vinci Code and all that sort of thing are accustomed to seeing Constantine blamed for this. He was not involved in this at all. In fact, he called and approved of the council that voted this down. So he was very much on the side of the Pope and the Orthodox bishops whose representatives and the bishops themselves were present at Nicaea. So that's a complete fabrication and misunderstanding.
Oh, yeah.
But there was an attempt to get the church to play ball with Roman politics during this era, and there were bishops who were all too ready to sell out this very most fundamental belief of the church, and that is the consubstantiality of the Father with the Son. Were willing to do it for the sake of temporal peace and prosperity in the Roman Empire.
And not to mention their own advancement in the royal court. You know, Eusebius of Nicomedia.
Well, that became an issue after Constantine was gone, I think. Constantine himself waffled a little, but he remained essentially a friend of orthodoxy, especially as compared with his successors.
Right.
But definitely later Roman emperors after Constantine pushed and promoted Arianism. His son, Constantius, pushed Arianism to the hilt and persecuted Orthodox Catholic Christianity.
Exactly. And that persecution of the Orthodox faith by the emperors, helped push a lot of bishops to go along to get along.
That's right. And eventually to join the persecutors of their fellow clergy.
Right.
Catholic clergy.
Right. So that they would, help push bishops. They would turn bishops in to be sent into exile. And in some cases, Orthodox bishops were martyred.
So one of the reasons this is an important story to tell right at the beginning, not just chronologically, is because this is the closest the church ever came to simply going extinct. Yeah. Orthodox Christian faith.
Yes.
Because, again, as many as 9 out of 10 Christian sees were in the hands of deniers of Orthodox beliefs about the divinity of Christ. And a very, very dangerous time.
In some ways, that denial of that key element of who Jesus Christ is was even worse than a lot of the moral denials that occurred later on. So, because that could destroy the very foundation of the church.
And the motivation, I think, more than anything else, was fear. I think cowardice drove a lot of it. Because our hindsight is 20/20. We know that Constantine was the first Christian emperor, and then a lot of people forget that other Arian emperors came later and persecuted Catholic Christianity. But we know in hindsight that ultimately the Roman Empire became Christian.
Right.
They didn't know that.
Exactly.
Emperors had been assassinated before this.
Right.
For more trivial matters.
Absolutely.
And Constantine's success was by no means a foregone conclusion. So I think most of these clergy were acting to solidify the Christian empire and using non-Christian secular political methods to do it because they feared the return of persecuting pagan emperors. Such as the ones they'd seen for the last 300 years.
But one of the points that we have to understand is that, as Newman himself brought out in the Arian Crisis book that he wrote, that it was the faith of the laity that called the bishops back, that the monks and the laity were the ones who rallied to the Orthodox faith. This other watered down Jesus Christ was not worth living or dying for.
Right.
Whereas the laity and the monks who taught them were very much the ones committed to bringing the bishops back to the Orthodox faith. And that is key.
I think the laity in those days were pretty canny. I think they saw from the beginning that this was a political scheme.
Sure.
That they understood the politics involved in it, and they saw that the bishops that were being put into, the bad bishops who were being put into place, who were willing to play ball with the emperors, they saw very clearly what was going on. They understood what we've been talking about. That it wasn't really about the theology. Theology was a pretext for. And they were being used as pawns or guinea pigs in the scheme.
I have sensed that it's not exactly, it's a moral issue that is somewhat parallel. We've had a lot of Catholic politicians who have been talked into finding a way to accommodate themselves to the anti-life positions by theologians. And a lot of bishops and priests have gone along with them. Don't talk about abortion. Don't talk about euthanasia. It's the same kind of dynamic as a way to get along with the politicians. We got to work hand in hand with them. And there's money at stake and all. That goes on. And it's the March for Life, for instance, that we were talking about earlier tonight. That is something that is pushed by clergy. There are plenty there, but it is lay people who really led it. And there's an important parallel between those who are cowardly
right.
in defending life and want to hush it up versus those who, the lay people saying, no, these are our babies. We're the ones having the babies. Right. You know, and we don't care about the politicians.
St. Paul said that he would become all things for all people if he could win some by doing that. I think it's part of our responsibility to be as kind, as winsome, as loving, as compromising as possible about things that we can compromise on.
Right.
Okay. Learning to tell the difference between our personal preferences, some style of music or some other thing that we like, learning how to tell the difference between something that is of the faith, de fide, and something that's a personal preference is very, very important.
Absolutely.
But when you do come to something that's non-negotiable, then you've got to be like a rock. You've got to stand firm. And so, admittedly, there's a challenge in all of it. But in a church like ours, where we've said the same thing on these life issues for 2,000 years, that's a no-brainer. That one's a no-brainer.
Non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the 10th and 11th century. So we're talking about the 900s and the first half of the 1000s AD. What's the crisis there?
Well, just the collapsed state of civilization in Western Europe seems to have caused a lot of it.
Sure. I mean, Charlemagne attempted to rebuild something, but the new set of invasions after he had died.
It almost made it worse. He was kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. Everybody said, here's a new Roman emperor.
Right.
Civilization's going to revive, and some of this lawlessness and chaos is going to cease. And it looked for a while as if it would be.
Right.
And then, but unfortunately, Constantine, great as he was, gave birth to a bunch of sons and grandsons.
Charlemagne, you mean?
So I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Charlemagne. He gave birth to a whole crop of sons and grandsons that were worthless.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing was frittered away within a few years afterwards.
Right.
And people almost became more bitter after that than they had been before.
And as Europe then broke down into these very petty princedoms headed by barbarian chieftains,
Right.
who pretended to be great nobility.
Well,
The
one
church-
of the things they liked to have was some clergymen at their beck and call.
Right.
They couldn't just steal everything that they wanted from the church, because probably the lay people wouldn't have stood for it. But
Right.
but if you could put the clergy in your pockets and have them working for you, that was a good thing from their perspective at that time. So the bad bishops created and hired a lot of bad priests and other clergy to help them with their program.
And again, to understand in this time of chaos, oftentimes people left their farms, their duchies, to monasteries or to bishops. Bishops were the ones who ruled the towns, while the lords ruled in castles
Right.
outside and ran the farming communities.
In the book, I call this the Mad Max era of Christianity, the post-apocalyptic era.
Right. If you've seen the Mad Max movies, it's that kind of chaos.
Right, and any petty strongman who is able to build a bit of a safe space for people behind some walls is able to set up his own little kingdom and rule as a dictator. So it was chaos.
Right.
And the clergy, unfortunately, responded in kind.
How did they come out of that? What was the way that, and again, we saw, especially by the 11th century, priests were living with their girlfriends. They in the rectories, in the priest house.
Oh yeah, one of the commonest abuses was the priest who married, even though at this time he wasn't supposed to. But in those days, they considered the marriage, even though it was illicit, they considered it to be an actual marriage.
Right.
They considered that it took, if you see what I'm saying. So,
but in the monasteries, it was a lot of homosexuality.
Right.
And there was a big difference that in monasteries it was homosexuality. In the diocesan priests, they were living with their common law wives,
Right.
sometimes.
It's an
How
ugly
did this
story.
come to a stop? What role did the people have in
Well,
helping to purify this period?
Absolutely, the fidelity of the lay people was still an enormous point. And you might think, well, how could the lay people be faithful when their priests were such bad examples? Well, a lot of them weren't, obviously. But enough were that they began to produce the people who, for example, a couple of centuries before this, began to be recruited by Benedict, Benedict of Nursia, into monasteries. So there was a revived monasticism. These people were the recruits, the faithful that were left, were the recruits who rebuilt civilization with the rise of monasticism, with all of these. And of course, great saints began to be produced, both lay and clerical saints.
That's one of the things that did happen along, even when the monasteries became corrupted, there were reforms of the monastic orders, the Benedictines, that got going.
Well, many of the orders didn't reform and just died.
Yep. Exactly.
Many of the monasteries failed.
Because you cannot sustain this facade of religious life if you are not living the authentic vocation. And saints came up, and St. Peter Damian was one of the greatest of that. He's a doctor of the church now. He was key. Pope Gregory VII, and there was he's Pope Saint Gregory VII. There's a Pope Saint Leo, and that these were also keys for that reform with the laity.
Right, and the tide turned. I mean, something we're seeing now. Apparently, great efforts have been made to cover up these skeletons in the church's closet of abuse of minors, abuse of adults that were adult subordinates in the seminaries and places of that type. Very serious attempts have been made to cover this stuff up, and apparently they've been successful for maybe 100 years.
Yeah.
But they have come to light.
Yep.
And the truth always does out that way.
Right.
That's the problem with the conspiracy theory mindset, is that you can't keep one of these things together for long. The truth outs.
And I think, today a lot of people are very angry at this, and it's understandable. And I think that we have to, in the face of this present crisis, remember what St. Paul wrote in Ephesians 4. Be angry, but sin not.
Right.
You can direct your anger. When you're raising kids, there are times you have to show anger to let them know this is dangerous. Your life is at stake if you play in the street, and other important
The
issues.
same St. Paul called himself the chief of sinners.
Yeah.
So when he called out sin when he saw it, it was from a position of saying, I'm not holier than thou. If justice were served rather than mercy, I'd be going to hell.
Right.
And if we approach these problems in the same spirit,
Right.
not self-righteousness,
Exactly.
but saying,
It's
there
not-
by the grace of God go
Not
I.
a matter of self-righteousness, recognizing our own sinfulness, and at the same time using our outrage at the bad things that are done to direct our energy to holiness and improvement and cleansing. This is the thing we have to do. We also have to take a break. We're a little bit over time on this, so we will take a break now. We will open up for your phone calls and questions from our studio audience, so please stay with us. All right, welcome back. And we're talking about, some of the periods of great abuse, especially by the clergy and the hierarchy in past periods of the church. Time of the Arian heresy, the sexual crisis of the 10th, 11th century, the chaos went on in the Avignon papacy and time of Reformation, and then the time of the up to the French Revolution, French nationalism. And what we'd like to do is start to open up to some questions here. We start off with Joseph. Joseph, where are you calling from?
Yes, Father. I'm calling from Point Lookout in New York.
Great, welcome. And your question?
Well, my question is that aren't there parallels today in terms of the faithfulness of the laity and the bishops in China who were in accord with the church, and now it appears that the hierarchy is throwing the faithful and those bishops that were faithful, to use the slang way of throwing them under the bus, and that these accommodations with the hierarchy and the Chinese government would appear to be parallel, where the laity and these bishops that were faithful to the church all these decades, if not century, are there not parallels today with regard to what's going on in China?
Do you want to respond to that?
I haven't studied the Chinese situation very carefully.
It's one of the things that is going on right now is that the government, the central government in China, is now destroying the churches of those who had been faithful to the Catholic Church, and they've been arresting priests, laity, and the bishops. And right after there was a concordat made with Pope Francis, and now in the face of that, they are attacking the Catholics who had remained faithful to the church.
Right.
So
That
this
sounds
is
like a mess. I will say something that would be helpful as a piece of historical background is a very close parallel is what was done at the end of the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. Horrible, bloody period of time when the French government made an out-and-out effort to eradicate Catholicism root and branch.
Yes.
And there were, of course, underground churches, underground clergy, secret masses said, mm-hmm. all of the other things, very similar to China. Yeah. At the end of the situation, though, when the persecution was still extremely bloody, Napoleon came along, took over what was left of the French Revolution in an attempt to save it, and did something that they hadn't been willing to do up to that point, and that was he made a deal with the Pope. He called the Pope in and said, look, we're not getting anywhere with this trying to make the French not Catholic. I'm willing to make a deal. So you use that word concordat, and that's what it was. Mm-hmm. The Pope agreed to, and Napoleon together agreed to make Christianity legal again in France and to stop the bloody persecutions, all again to stop so much bloodshed.
Yeah. They killed hundreds of thousands of Catholics, especially in the Vendée region of France.
And very horrible stuff.
Oh, it was awful.
But absolutely, the Pope compromised. The Pope allowed the seminaries to continue teaching that papal infallibility was not necessarily part of the faith. He made all sorts of other concessions to what was called Gallicanism at that time. He allowed, obviously suboptimal situation. Keep in mind, papal infallibility hadn't been defined yet at that point.
That's right.
But the Pope made what might be seen as compromises in order to stop that bloodshed. So, I haven't studied the Chinese situation carefully. I will say that things like this have been done in the past, compromises about things that you and I might second guess, that the Pope made a hard call. Mm-hmm. Now, it may be, again, I'm not current with today's news on the subject, but mm-hmm. it may be that the Chinese government has, opened a new chapter now in persecuting the the continuing churches.
The idea was that the government would help to appoint bishops with their approval, and then Rome would approve. But when they did that, the government started persecuting the others.
Yeah.
And, bad things happened with the Concordat with Mussolini.
Right.
And the Concordat with Hitler.
It's a messy thing.
When you're dealing with people who themselves are anti-religious, atheistic governments and the kind of nationalistic governments,
right.
like Nazism, National Socialism, the fascists, and the communists. These are tough to deal with,
right.
And
I'll just say that I'm glad that I don't have to make those kind of real world calls on a regular basis. So, but other than that, I don't know enough to make an intelligent comment.
But there does seem to be some parallels with these past problems too. I have a question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Good to have you. And your question or comment?
Well, ahead of the show, you had kind of teased us with that there have been abuses or actions by the clergy in way distant past that it would make even the abuses of today's clergy pale in comparison.
Yes.
We're kind of talking about broader things, it seems like, and is it true?
Some juicy details, right?
Well, sure.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
Well, I will say that you should read the book. That sounds like a commercial, I guess. But
some things are not meant for. We have a lot of young people in the audience.
Yeah, the book is not very wholesome at times, and for a reason, to show in a way that that we might not do on a family show on primetime TV. Some of these stories would curl your hair. They really would, and they're in the book.
Yeah.
Let me give an example that's just something weird rather than salacious or something along those lines. And this is the famous event called the Cadaver Synod.
Oh, yeah.
During the period that we were talking about, the age of Mad Max post-apocalyptic Christianity, one of the political situations, we had a pope who was so angry and incensed at his predecessor, his immediate predecessor, Pope Formosus, that for political reasons, not really religious reasons, that he actually had him dug up 9 months after his death and put on trial for political and ecclesiastical crimes.
And they put his vestments on.
Oh, they dressed him up. They put him on a papal throne and put him up on trial. They had a junior deacon stand by to answer for the Pope, for Pope Formosus, should he choose, as many expected, that he would exercise his right to remain silent. And he did, and not surprisingly was convicted. And they had him. They had his body stripped and flung into the Tiber.
Yeah.
And so, very grotesque, strange image happening in the papal palace.
This is what gives barbarians a bad name.
I think
doing
so.
This weird stuff.
So if you thought we exaggerated with the Mad Max stuff, I mean that's like something you would see out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
And so that's an example, a pope who thought that was the proper way to behave as the successor of Peter. That's one example. But of course, the whole book is a chronicle, really, of really party animals. I call one of the popes the rock star pope.
Yeah.
There's another pope.
Which one?
I was afraid he was going to ask me that.
Was it the Benedict?
This book has such an alphabet soup of Roman numerals in it that I won't even try to remember all of that. There's dozens of popes and bishops in there.
Alexander the Sixth had that reputation.
To tell you the truth, interestingly, there's enough dispute about Alexander the Sixth at this point that I left him out of the book. For many years, he was given as the example of the worst ever Renaissance pope, and most of the Renaissance popes were no prizes.
That's right.
But he was usually given as an example of the worst, and I think some of these others might have been worse. John the 12th, I believe.
He's
Benedict the 9th. These are the guys. Well, one of them bought and sold the papacy twice just for gold.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, just some of the things, you know.
And he was made pope when he was a teenager. So he was buying and selling it, you know.
I think, he may have been as young as 12.
Yeah, yeah.
Another pope was so free with simony that he once ordained a wealthy horse trader for money while still in the stable where the offer was made. Yeah. Ordained him a bishop on the spot.
Yeah.
And then, of course,
not
there's
much ceremonial to that.
And then there's all of the, you know, again, bed hopping and, you know, unsavory.
That unsavory stuff, you got to get the book.
That's
to see there. But
that's right. But it is all to a purpose. It's not just salacious details, because the purpose, again, is I think when people. One of the problems with what's going on now is a lot of us have been babes in the woods. Yeah. We haven't known this kind of history. We never heard of this kind of stuff before. And when we see it, we are apt to go all apocalyptic, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think we ought to behave and treat it as a crisis, as it is, mm-hmm. and root this cover-up out, which in many ways is worse than the bad acts themselves, because you know, the bad acts were the works of, you know, a few deviants, a relatively small number of deviants.
Yeah, about 1.8% of priests have been involved in the sex abuse of minors.
Whereas the cover-up seemed to have been very consciously done by respected prelates who are still respected prelates today. So, again, don't read the book to get salacious stories, but do read it to get sobered up. Yeah. It's 3 cups of black coffee and a cold shower for people who may have been living in a bit of a fool's paradise.
Let's take another call. We have Christopher. Christopher, where are you calling from?
Dallas, Texas.
Great. I love Dallas. I was there for Christmas time. What can we do for you today? What's your question?
Well, in light of the recent scandals, my question's a historical one. Historically, when did the church not allow priests to marry? What was the reason?
Sure.
Father, you can probably field this one better than I.
Yeah, in the earliest part of the church, there were a mixture of bishops and priests who were celibate and those who were married. And you see, Paul, for instance, was celibate, and Jesus Christ obviously was celibate. So this was part of the early church, but there were also married bishops and priests. By the time of Nicaea, it became preferable that if they were still married, that they would live as brother and sister with their wife. And then that's difficult.
I think it's important to say that celibacy was always the ideal.
Yeah.
I mean, in no uncertain terms, St. Paul says, I wish that you were even as I am.
Right.
In other words, I wish that you could live, he who marries does well, but he who remains unmarried does better. He says it explicitly.
But the theology of it is that a priest acts in the person of Jesus Christ. This is not only traditional theology, 6 times in the Vatican II documents, it teaches that priests act in the person of Christ. That's why I say at Mass, this is my body. I say, I baptize you. In confession, I say, I absolve you. I'm acting in the person of Christ as I do that. But that also has an implication. Christ is the bridegroom of the church. And therefore, if I act in the person of Christ, I must love the church as a groom loves his bride. The church is not my employer. It's my spouse. And I have to have that kind of love for the church. And this is something where it's more helpful. You see, and I'm sure you're a convert from Protestantism. Among Protestant ministers, along with police officers, have the highest divorce rate for any profession in the country.
Right.
It's a strain because they feel that difficulty. So this is where celibacy came from. And by the Council of Elvira and a number of other councils, this became the norm in the West. In the East, there still were married clergy, but they could never be bishops.
Yeah.
And that's still the case. And that's even true in the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. But in the West, we went for complete celibacy. That was motivated a lot by the monastic movement as well. So that's where that came from. And, you know, some people have tried to say that if priests were married, there wouldn't be the sex abuse scandals. That's not true. As an example of that, you look at the teachers in this country, 9.4% have abused children versus 1.8% of priests. And they're married. So that's
I saw recently a report
where we have to get going. We are flat out of time. Again, it's Bad Shepherds, the dark years in which the faithful thrive while bishops did the devil's work, by Rod Bennett. Get it from EWTNRC.com, item 7145. Thank you again for being here. I'm sorry we have to rush, but I want to give you all a blessing. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And we can bring Rod here and do all the other guests that we have only because this network is brought to you by you. You make it possible to cover World Youth Day and the March for Life. So keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill, and we will pay our bills too. Thank you, and God bless.